But the WHO came out basically saying that meat kind of is a carcinogen, mostly processed meat, but also kind of sneering at real ancestral red meats. And it was based on lots of studies, but when you go through them, they're all junk studies, associations with like a 1.08 hazard ratio, and anything less than 2 is meaningless. But they were happy to come out based on junk science and state that. They actually spent the time. So what's wrong with them?
It was such a crazy thing, Ivor. So that happened in 2015. It was the IARC report, so the International Association for Research on Cancer report. And then they made the decision and they published it in 2015. And then in 2018, the real details of how they came to that decision came out. So who knows why it took them 3 years to actually show their work, quote unquote. But the 2015 decision, as you're saying, I believe was saying that processed meat was a class 2A carcinogen and non-processed red meat was a class 2B. A lot of the committee was actually vegetarians who didn't disclose their biases. And they had, I believe, over 400 studies that might give some indication of connections between meat, both processed and unprocessed, and cancer. If you just look at the non-processed red meat studies, there were hundreds, and they whittled it down to 14 studies, I believe. It was either 14 or 15 studies. So they excluded probably over 200 or 300 studies for whatever reason. And the studies they looked at were entirely observational. There were no interventional studies that they actually considered to make this decision about the connection between red meat and cancer. And there are many animal studies and there are interventional studies in humans that suggest that red meat is not inflammatory, that there's really no mechanistic basis by which red meat would cause cancer in the intestines. And so with 14 considered for their decision, you might think that the majority of those studies would show an association between red meat and cancer. I'm going to get this number slightly wrong. I think it was 14 studies, and I believe 8 of the 14 showed no association between red meat and cancer. And of the 6 that were remaining, 5, the association between red meat and cancer was not statistically significant. And so what you were left with for this IARC, this WHO decision that was proclamation, was that 1 out of 14 studies actually showed a statistically significant association between red meat consumption and cancer. And if you look at that one study, it was done in Loma Linda, California. It was done in a community of Seventh-day Adventists. Are a religious sect that shuns red meat. They shun all meat. And so in a religious group that shuns red meat, do we think that possibly the people that are eating more red meat might also be doing other rebellious things like drinking alcohol or having other unhealthy behaviors? And if you actually dig into that study, what you'll find is that in the people who had this connection between red meat and cancer, there was also a higher incidence of obesity and insulin resistance. And as we know, observational studies really can't tease all this out. So is it possible that the people who are eating more red meat also happened to be more rebellious and also looked like they were more obese and more insulin resistant? Absolutely. And that's what you see in the study. But the investigators only made the association between red meat and cancer. And there's actually a stronger association between the obesity and the insulin resistance and the cancer incidence. So wait a minute, the WHO decision, the reason that everyone thinks red meat causes cancer is because of a decision based on the proclamation or the consensus of this group of people who met in France under lock and key, the majority of which were vegetarians who didn't disclose their bias. They excluded the majority of the studies. The studies they did include were observational. The majority of those studies didn't show an association between red meat and cancer. And the one study that showed a statistically significant association is probably confounded by what we might call unhealthy user bias. When you realize that that is the reason that we think red meat causes cancer, it's absurd. And like I said, there are many studies that suggest the mechanism just isn't there. And there are many studies that show the reverse, that red meat is not associated with cancer in any way, shape, or form, especially if you go to Asian community.
You know, if you look at the entirety of the science and all the studies, it's unquestionable. But that meat is an ancestral human evolutionary food. It doesn't mean it's magical. But the suggestion that meat is in any way negative as a food is is just inherently absurd. And if you look at the mechanistic, the associational, and even the RCTs, there are some RCTs on meat, but they were very disappointed with them because they didn't show a problem. If anything, they showed a benefit. So those RCTs, like I say, was quietly ignored. So they ignore the real science because, quite honest, like a lot of science in the last 20, 30 years, they set out with a goal. They know what they're looking for in advance. They're not unbiased. There's a reason all these studies are done. And mostly when it's meat, people who are going after that topic, they know what they're looking for. That meat's a problem because of the environment, because of cow belches, because of just vegetarian and veganism, which is a very powerful lobby group. They're highly ideological and motivated. So meat, meat just to me is a superfood without overstepping the bounds. It's a superfood because of its nutrient density. All of the healthy fats, iron, other minerals, all the protein, complete proteins. We're eating basically what we're made of. So it's perfectly compatible. It's highly nutrient dense. So it seems that the carnivores around the world, they're thriving. All the examples I know are thriving. And what's more, have also fixed issues that have been long-term problems for them and resolved their health issues and are thriving across the board. That's a general truth, isn't it?
112,000 men and 184,000 women. And the pooled analysis did not provide evidence of a higher risk of mortality for total meat intake. And they provided an inverse association with red meat, poultry, and fish and seafood. And get this, red meat was associated inversely with cardiovascular disease in men and with cancer mortality in women in Asian countries. So that's a huge study in Asia that was conveniently ignored. Oh, here's beef tallow, which is derived generally from the suet. This increased apoptosis and decreased aberrant crypt foci formation relative to our nemesis polyunsaturated fats in soybean oil in the rat colon. So there's an interventional study in animals showing that if you give rats tallow from suet, that decreased the formation of precancerous lesions relative to soybean oil. Soybean oil actually increased the formation of those lesions. Well, there's an interventional study in animals suggesting that an animal fat actually does the reverse of causing cancer. That's striking. The effects of meat, beef, chicken, and bacon on rat colon carcinogenesis. And what they found was actually that the bacon-fed rats, it was protective. Yeah. And they say the results suggest that in rats, beef does not promote the growth of aberrant crypt foci, the same acronym from the previous study. Chicken does not protect against colon carcinogenesis, and a bacon-based diet appeared to protect against carcinogenesis, perhaps because bacon contained 5% sodium chloride, increased the rat's water intake. They couldn't say why, but pork actually protected those rats against colon cancer.
But also we have TMAO, the whole TMAO scare, and you can see that came out of the vegetarian universities as well, and it's completely absurd. And a couple of years ago, they did a study, an RCT on women, menopausal, postmenopausal women, so not an associational, and they actually gave them, I think, taurine in such huge amounts that they got their TMAO levels in their blood up an order of magnitude, 10 times normal, and maintained them for 6 months. And they didn't show a single shimmer, the slightest change in any cardiovascular lipids, ratios, or a range of inflammatory markers. So 10 times the TMAO level enforced caused nothing. And yet they try and maintain the other guys. If your TMAO is up 10%, because it may be associated with eating meat, it associates with a higher blah, blah, blah. But TMAO levels associate or are directly the result of kidney disease, which is kind of diabetes. So all they're seeing is an association. More diabetic people, higher TMAO in their blood. Of course it links to heart disease. It's kind of scientific fraud, and deep down they know what they're doing. The best I can say for these people is they've got a cognitive dissonance where they're subconsciously biasing rather than actively falsifying. But it's still bad. Still bad.
Assessment of causal direction between gut microbiota-dependent metabolites, that's TMAO, and cardiometabolic health. And what they come to the finding out here is that it's reverse causality. Our Mendelian randomization support that type 2 diabetes and kidney disease increase TMAO levels, and observational evidence for cardiovascular diseases may be due to confounding or reverse causality, which is basically just fancy words for when you have diabetes or kidney disease, your TMAO goes up, your diabetes or your kidney disease could be causing your cardiovascular disease. That is called reverse causality. And almost everyone accepts this now. If you are just eating animal meat and say plants, where do you get your bioavailable vitamin A? Well, if you're eating eggs, you'll get some retinoic acid from egg yolks. But I suspect that a lot of people are nutrient deficient, are sort of low-level vitamin A deficiency because beta-carotene in plant foods is not converted that well to retinoic acid in the human body. You both have to eat way more plant vitamin A than you would from animals. And I think the conversion is like 19,000 to 1. If you're even, so like 19,000 units of beta-carotene is equal to 1 bioactive unit of retinoic acid. So liver is really the powerhouse of vitamin A. Kidneys are a great source as well. Egg yolks are good too. And in a way, egg yolks are kind of eating nose to tail. And I will just mention here that the liver is not a filter. It doesn't store toxins like people think it does. It processes those toxins through phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification systems for export in the urine or the feces. It doesn't store, your liver doesn't just hold on to heavy metals and pesticides. It moves them out of the body. And because it's such an enzymatic powerhouse to do that, it is full of nutrients that are required for those biochemical reactions. Vitamin A is rich in the liver. And again, for most people, I would not worry about vitamin A toxicity eating, ounces of liver every day. And I anecdotally, in myself and people I've worked with, I know people who have eaten a pound of liver a day for weeks or half a pound a day and had vitamin A levels that were completely normal in their body. So this notion that you could get vitamin A toxicity over consuming a few ounces of liver or an ounce of liver per day is just silly. But beyond vitamin A, the question I always ask people is, where do you get your riboflavin? And that's a difficult question to answer if you're not eating liver or heart. If you have enough riboflavin, you can take a, quote, broken MTHFR like mine that functions slowly and make it function just as fast as normally. So I don't have to supplement with methylfolate, which is another compound that is found in liver that's not found in muscle meat. But I don't have to supplement with methylfolate with an MTHFR polymorphism because I get enough riboflavin from heart and liver. And so that's the question, is where are you getting your riboflavin from? The amount of riboflavin in muscle meat is moderate, but heart and liver are much better. And I think a lot of people, and I see this repeatedly, Ivor, with my clients, people I've worked with over the years, if they're only eating muscle meat, you'll see the homocysteine bump. And so if homocysteine is above 8, in my opinion, you don't have enough folate or riboflavin. And usually it's a riboflavin deficiency. People add back in liver and they do great because they get more folate and more riboflavin. And the list goes on and on. I mean, choline, biotin, B6, pantothenic acid, zinc, and copper. Copper balances zinc. And if you over supplement with zinc, which I think is happening more and more these days in the COVID pandemic, people just hear, I need zinc, and they're taking 50 or 100 milligrams of zinc, and you don't balance that with copper, like would have happened in our ancestors when we were eating liver, you're going to get zinc, you're going to get copper deficient. And copper deficiency can manifest just like B12 deficiency clinically. You get sort of posterior column signs, balance issues. You can get all sorts of problems. It's not a good thing to get copper deficient. You don't want to do that. The human body is elegantly designed to eat animals from nose to tail. It just works so well. You go in the sun, there are all of these nutrients that are made in the skin that are beyond cholecalciferol, which is the precursor to 25-hydroxy-vitamin D, which is what we measure, which is a precursor to 1,25-hydroxy-vitamin D, which is the active form of vitamin D. I've done a podcast with Malcolm Kendrick in which we talked about the importance of nitric oxide at the level of the endothelium. And I think there are a few things more important than nitric oxide at the level of the endothelium. Things that decrease nitric oxide in the endothelium seem to create more atherosclerosis. Things that increase nitric oxide seem to be beneficial. This is a completely LDL independent mechanism. So do you want to make more nitric oxide in ultraviolet light? Yeah. Do you want to just sit inside all day with fears of skin cancer and just take a vitamin D supplement? I would say no. Anecdotally, whenever I post online about these anecdotal stories of people who have less burning from the sun when they go to an animal-based diet and cut out the seed oils, you get hundreds, if not thousands of voices chiming in and saying, me too. Now that's so cool that I have to hypothesize that a lot of skin cancer risk, whether it's squamous, basal, or melanoma, which is not an entirely sun-related cancer, are potentially worsened, exacerbated by seed oils, excess seed oil consumption in our skin. So it really connects everything. And the thing I wanted to say is that you mentioned vitamin K2, and that was one nutrient that I left out from liver. So important. And people will say, because I'll often make the claim, as I did on Rogan, there are tons of nutrients that you can get in animal foods that you can't get in plant foods. And that's something important to really emphasize here. I see a real discordance. I see a real inequality favoring animal foods because of the number of nutrients that are only found in animal foods in any appreciable quantity. Many of the ones I mentioned earlier, riboflavin, choline, etc., but also vitamin K2. And when I say K2, people will come back and say, wait, you can get vitamin K2 in natto. But what I'll say to them in response is, but you can't get the full spectrum MK4 to MK11. As you said, it's mostly MK7, I believe, that's in natto and the plant foods. But you're not going to get MK4, and you're not going to get MK5 or 6 or 8 or 9. And so a full spectrum of menaquinones only found in animal foods. But get in the sun, get real vitamin D. You've got to. There's all these compounds we don't even know about. And I love that you wrapped it back in. It's like, man, you mean it's just as simple as living like my ancestors did for the last 2 million years? Yeah, it's just that simple, right?
So no seed oil, sugars, refined grains, refined carbohydrates. You take that stuff out and start adding in all of what we've talked about. It's enormous. It's synergistic. You'll sleep better. You'll be able to deal with stress better. Mental acuity will rise, especially with fasting, which is kind of a supercharger. You suddenly get more sun because you realize the science on skin cancer was very biased. So you get more sun, you get the nitric oxide, you get the vitamin D, you get all the other photoproducts. You add in organ meats and fatty meats and connective tissue and maybe bone broth, and marrow, all this stuff. And you just do it all together and you start fasting, which this animal-based low-carb diet will make you much more of a fat burner within a matter of days and weeks. So you'll be able to skip meals like our ancestors, right? And you do it all together. But people don't know it because society, all the boffins and professors and the nutritionists are actually directing people in the opposite direction for several decades. So no one even believes anymore you can change your diet and lifestyle and it's going to transform you, because change of diet to help you has been discredited by all of the bodies who have given people the wrong diets, and of course they didn't work. So they've discredited fixing your diet. Can you imagine? It's outrageous.
I do think it's funny that amidst mainstream Western medicine, the party line from physicians is diet has no influence on COVID. Diet has no influence on Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. Diet has no influence on eczema, psoriasis, Sjogren's, Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And I just think you guys are making a mockery of this, because I can show you tens, if not hundreds of cases for every single one of those diseases where diet made a huge improvement. When I was at PaleoFX and KetoCon last year, people would come up to me left and right and say, my ulcerative colitis completely reversed on a carnivore diet or an animal-based diet. And I have clients, my eczema, head to toe eczema went away. My psoriasis is completely better. And then in this next sentence, they'll always say kind of the Koch's postulate kind of thing, like, but I cheat sometimes and it comes back. And I'm like, well, what are we doing?